In our gospel this morning, the man born blind and healed by Jesus clearly states, "I was blind, but now I see." In baptism, God opens our eyes to see the truth of who we are, God's beloved daughters and sons. And as David was anointed king of Israel, God anoints the newly baptized. God anoints those in need of healing, and God anoints the dying with oil. God seems to choose those who are most vulnerable, broken, and dead. God does this to claim us, to comfort us, and to make us witnesses to the light of Jesus in life and in death. But notice that John doesn't call him the blind man, but the man born blind. John identifies him by his humanity before his blindness. But it seems everyone else is concerned with who sinned. Who sinned? Who is to blame? Who should carry the shame? But Jesus is only concerned that the way of God's glory might be revealed in this man. The question these disciples concerned themselves with was who sinned? It's their first instinct. They want to clear this up. They want to make sense of these facts by placing the blame. The man is blind. Whose fault is it? There must be a reason. There's got to be a source, and we've got to get to the bottom of it. We've got to identify it and more than likely get rid of it, expel it, so that we ourselves don't become susceptible to it. Rene Girard writes extensively about scapegoating in his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. He reflects on the ritual practice on the Day of Atonement in ancient Israel. The ritual consisted of driving into the wilderness a goat on which all of the sins of Israel had been placed. The high priest in the ritual placed his hands on the head of that goat, and that act was supposed to transfer onto that animal everything that was likely to poison the relationship between members of the community and between the community and God. The effectiveness of this ritual was the idea that all the sins were expelled with that goat. The farther and farther the goat wandered away from the community was rid of that goat and all of those sins. The man born blind is being put into that scapegoat position. It's clear to the disciples there are no alternate facts. Blindness is this man's sin. We have cause, we have effect. It's as simple as that. And we can't associate with this man. Because if, God forbid, somehow that sin is contagious, we'll all become blind. And the disciples are not all that different than we are. We have trouble seeing the scapegoated other as good or right or as a child of God. Our own keeping them at a distance from ourselves and our community is just looking out for our well-being. Keeping our distance through the walls of class and race, of geography, or any other protective action isn't doing them any damage. We're not being hateful. We're not the bad guys. We're just trying to protect our communities and our families. We're trying to keep the moral fabric of society intact. We're trying to protect ourselves from whatever sin that's keeping all those others as being as great and as sinless as we are. Who are the scapegoats in your life today? We spend a lot of time and energy wondering who can be blamed for our own or others' tragedies. Who can be blamed for those horrible things that happen to us? our parents, ourselves, our neighbors, the people who voted for the person that we didn't, the people who stayed home and didn't vote, the media, the immigrants, the illegals, the Jews, the Muslims, the gays, the blacks, the people who don't share our morals, who don't share our religious beliefs and values. The list goes on and on and on. One of my favorite spiritual authors, Henry Nouwen, the Dutch priest, known for his deep and rich spirituality, discovered the unconditional love of God through serving others in community, particularly others that society pushes away and wonders about their sin and brokenness. Nouwen believed that what is most personal is most universal. He reflected on how radical life would be if we were willing to move beyond the blaming of others to proclaiming the work of God. All of us have tragedies in life, and we rarely, if ever, have much control over them. But we often live stubbornly, determined to blame others for these destructive events in our own lives. And when we do that, we lean and rely on blame as a way out, as a coping mechanism for dealing with tragedy. Sometimes we carry the weight of that blame ourselves, or we set up scapegoats to place that guilt and blame on, hoping they wander far away from us, never to return. And we fail. We fail to work through our anger and our grief, and we avoid God by handling our emotions and making sense of the often senseless through blame. Nouwen wisely reminds us that Jesus doesn't allow us to solve our own or other people's problems through blame. The challenge, he notes, is to discern, in the midst of our darkness, the light of God. Beloveds, in Jesus' vision, everything, even the greatest of tragedy, can become an occasion in which God's works can be revealed. Who are the people you think deserve to be blamed this day? Our bishop has a newly published book titled Without Shame or Fear, From Adam to Christ. It's a short little book, and I've been reading it this Lent, and I've gone back and reread it, and I commend it to you. Bishop Rob asked the question in his chapter that includes the gospel reading from this day. He asked the question, where do you feel shame? Not when in your life have you felt shame, but where, deep inside yourself, physically, do you feel it? I think he asked this question because emotions are not ideas. We try and solve our life's challenges in our heads. And yet we know that those feelings and emotions leak out of our heads and into all parts of our bodies. They often manifest themselves in places that we've never known we could feel emotion in. The feelings of anger and excitement, fear and stress may cause you very different physical reactions. When our bishop feels shame, he says it manifests as a kind of faltering or frailty right behind his eyes. It's hard for him to even look at anything. He just wants to enter into a dark space to hide, to neither see nor be seen. I can relate to that. And the image that the bishop writes about, and those that writers and spiritual artists throughout time have done, link the emotion of shame and the eyes. Our Our bishop links the Genesis story of Adam and Eve and how the first consequence of the fall is not a slap on the wrist, it's not verbal chastisement. The effect of their sin is revealed by the opening of their eyes. It's not the fact that they can see that is harmful, but it is what they see that hurts them. We know the story. We can relate to their angst. They see themselves as naked. They see themselves as vulnerable. They see themselves as infinitely separate from God. Beloveds, shame distorts how we see who we are in relationship to God, and by extension, how we see the world itself. Shame wants to blind us. What shame separates you from others and from our God today? This isn't one of those sermons with 3 questions and 3 easy answers. We're blinded by our own sin. Sin that blocks our ability from seeing who we really are and blinds us from seeing ourselves and our neighbors as children of the light. Sin muddies the water of life. Sin is like mud caked on our eyes that keeps us from seeing ourselves and others as God longs and desperately wants us to see. But God has anointed and called each one of us through the baptismal covenant that we recite every time there is a baptism in this community. That covenant to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbor as ourselves. We'll repeat those words the Sunday following Easter when we will baptize a new member of this community. We'll baptize her in the living waters of this font that is central in our worship space. We'll baptize her in Jesus' saliva, which is incarnate of living water. Living water that fashioned with the dust of the earth becomes mud or clay, depending on the translation. The same mud that you were fashioned from. The same mud that brought enlightenment to the man born blind. And the same very mud that God uses to restore all creation through these very waters of baptism. Beloveds, may your mud season be holy. May it be full of the dust of this earth and the water and the spit of Jesus our Christ as you splash in the incarnational living waters of Jesus, the Christ, our Savior